The rain had just started when Admiral Cole Harrington pushed open the door of the small roadside diner. The kind of place where the lights buzzed softly and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. He wasn't there for attention. He simply wanted a quiet meal after a long drive. But the retired Navy SEAL, known in town for his calm presence and sharp instincts, sensed something was off the moment he walked in. It was the kind of feeling that had once kept him alive on missions far from home. At first glance, everything seemed normal. A couple chatted in a corner booth. An older man read a newspaper near the window. And behind the counter, a young waitress moved quickly between tables. Her smile looked practiced, almost too careful, as if she was trying to hide the weight of something she didn't want anyone to notice. But Admiral Harrington noticed. He always did. When she placed the menu in front of him, he spotted the faint bruises along her wrist, half covered by her sleeve. They weren't dramatic, but they were their small marks that didn't belong on someone who worked in a warm little diner. Her voice trembled slightly when she asked if he wanted coffee, and though she tried to pull her hand back quickly, he had already seen enough to know something wasn't right. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. Instead, he watched quietly, observing the room with the steady calm of a man trained to read danger before anyone else could see it. Every movement the waitress made felt like she was trying not to draw attention to herself. Every time the door opened, she flinched just a little. And when a tall man in a dark jacket walked in and sat at the far end of the counter, her face seemed to lose all color. The Admiral's instincts sharpened. He had no intention of getting involved in something that wasn't his business. At least that's what he told himself. But when the man's cold eyes followed the waitress with a look that froze the room, Admiral Harrington realized this wasn't just a passing concern. Something deeper was happening here, something that the town had quietly overlooked. And as the waitress approached the man with slow, hesitant steps, the Admiral felt the moment tightening like a knot in his chest. Whatever was going on, it was about to reach a breaking point, and he knew he couldn't just sit there and watch. But what he did next would leave the entire town talking for weeks. The man at the counter didn't speak at first. He just stared at the waitress with a look that made the air feel colder. Admiral Harrington kept his eyes on them without moving his head, the way he used to study threats in unfamiliar territory. The diner's warm lights suddenly felt dimmer, as if the whole room sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to react. The waitress set a cup of coffee in front of the man, her hands slightly shaky. She whispered something he didn't seem to like because he leaned in closer and murmured back with a tone that made her stiffen. She nodded quickly, as if agreeing was the only option. Admiral Harrington noticed every small detail: her forced smile, her tense shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the kitchen door as if she wished she could hide there. He didn't know her name yet, but he could tell this wasn't just a bad day or a simple argument. There was history in her eyes, something heavy that she had been carrying for a long time. People in small towns often learn to keep quiet, to not get involved, but that kind of silence never sat right with him. Still, he needed to understand more before stepping in. He glanced around the diner again. The older man with the newspaper occasionally peeked over the top of it, pretending not to watch. The couple in the booth had stopped their conversation and were listening without making it obvious. Even the cook in the back paused near the service window, his expression unreadable. It was clear everyone knew something, but no one seemed willing to say it out loud. Admiral Harrington had seen situations like this before, where fear shaped people's choices. The waitress returned to refill his water, and up close, he saw the exhaustion behind her polite smile. When he quietly asked if she was okay, she froze for a second, then simply nodded and hurried away. That tiny reaction told him more than any long explanation could. The Admiral leaned back in his seat, heart steady but alert. Whatever was happening here ran deeper than a few unsettling glances. And as the man at the counter continued to watch her every move, Harrington knew the night was far from over. The waitress drifted toward the back of the diner again, moving like someone who had taught herself to stay small, to not attract attention. Admiral Harrington watched her disappear through the kitchen door, and for a moment, the room felt strangely hollow without her presence. The man at the counter, however, didn't take his eyes off that door. His fingers tapped against the ceramic mug in a slow, steady rhythm, the kind of rhythm that carried impatience or control. Admiral Harrington took a sip of his coffee, thinking back to the years he spent overseas. He had seen this pattern before: someone trapped, someone afraid, someone living under a pressure that outsiders rarely understood. The difference now was that he wasn't wearing a uniform, and this wasn't a battlefield. But fear didn't care about setting. It looked the same everywhere. A young busboy emerged from the kitchen with a tray of plates. He glanced at the man at the counter, then quickly looked away, almost dropping a fork in the process. His reaction didn't go unnoticed. Harrington quietly observed him, catching the hint of worry in the boy's eyes. Whatever the man represented, it wasn't new to the staff. They had seen him before. Their unease was too familiar that the Admiral shifted his focus to the walls of the diner. Old photographs showed smiling locals at summer fairs, fishing trips, and softball games. It was a town that looked peaceful on the surface, the kind where people waved at each other from across the street. But every small town had secrets. Some were just better hidden than others. The cook finally stepped out from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He exchanged a quick look with the man at the counter, one that held no friendliness, only tension. Then his eyes briefly met Harrington's, as if silently asking how much he had noticed. It was enough to confirm the Admiral's suspicion. This wasn't just a personal issue between the waitress and the stranger. It was something the whole diner tiptoed around. Still, no one spoke a word. And when the kitchen door opened again and the waitress stepped out, her expression carefully blank. Harrington knew he was watching a story far more complicated than he'd first imagined. One that was quietly pulsing beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer stay hidden. The night wore on, and the diner's atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. Admiral Harrington felt it in the airy, quiet storm about to break. The man at the counter remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the waitress as if he owned every inch of the room. She moved carefully, speaking softly to customers. But her eyes betrayed the fear she tried so hard to hide. Harrington's own instincts, honed by years of high-stakes missions, screamed at him that something was wrong, something urgent. The bruises on her wrist were just the surface, a silent cry beneath layers of silence. The waitress was carrying a weight no one else seemed ready to confront, and the man at the counter was the cause of it. But no one in the diner dared to say a word. The silence was louder than any scream. The older man with the newspaper shifted in his seat, glancing over the top as if debating whether to intervene. The couple at the booth whispered quietly but kept stealing nervous looks at the tense scene unfolding near the counter. Even the cook behind the service window stopped for a moment, his face tight with worry. It was as if the whole diner held its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment the quiet would shatter. Suddenly, the waitress approached the man again, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression darkened. Harrington could see the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The tension was electric, so thick it pressed down on Harrington's chest. He felt a surge of determination rise inside him. This wasn't just another stranger passing through town. This was a crisis hidden in plain sight, a desperate call for help wrapped in silence and bruises. But how far could he go without overstepping? How much danger was she in? As the waitress turned to leave, the man suddenly stood up, blocking her path. The diner seemed to freeze, every eye locked on the unfolding confrontation. The soft murmur of conversation died down to nothing. The moment stretched, fragile and taut, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Admiral Harrington's heart pounded. Whatever happened next would change everything, just as the man's shadow loomed over the waitress. Ready to stop her in her tracks, something unexpected happened. The older man with the newspaper suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade. Enough. The diner fell into a stunned silence, all eyes turning toward him. No one had expected him to speak, least of all the man at the counter. The tall man's face tightened, a flicker of surprise flashing in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in a place where everyone seemed too afraid to stand up. But the older man didn't back down. He stepped forward, slowly, with a quiet confidence that didn't fit his age or appearance. "You don't scare us," he said firmly, his gaze steady on the stranger. For a moment, the waitress looked as if she might collapse from relief. Admiral Harrington watched the scene unfold, realizing this was more than just a simple conflict between two people. There were layers here, stories that had been buried beneath fear and silence for far too long. Then, just when it seemed the situation might finally break open, the man at the counter reached into his jacket. The diner held its breath, hearts racing. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a crumpled photograph and slammed it on the counter. The image showed the waitress, smiling, vibrant, and free from years ago. Next to her was the man himself, younger, but with the same cold expression. The photo told a story of a past they all didn't know but felt in the tension filling the room. Admiral Harrington leaned forward, his mind racing. The bruises on her wrist were just the beginning. This was about history, secrets that tangled the whole town in a web of silence and fear. The stakes were higher than he thought, and now, more than ever, he needed to act. But the question was, how deep did this go? And who else was involved in the shadows? The diner was no longer just a quiet place for coffee. It had become the heart of a mystery that could shake the town to its core. And the night was far from over. The diner held its breath as the man's eyes locked onto the photograph, his expression flickering between anger and something darker, regret, maybe. The older man's voice broke the silence again. "You think showing a picture changes the past? It doesn't. What matters is what happens now." The waitress, trembling but steady, finally found her voice. "I'm done hiding." Her words cut through the tension like a lifeline thrown into stormy waters. She turned to the man, her eyes blazing with a courage that surprised everyone. "You don't get to control me anymore." Suddenly, Admiral Harrington rose from his seat, stepping between them. His presence was calm but firm, an unspoken promise of protection. "This ends here. No more fear, no more silence." His Navy SEAL instincts kicked in as he scanned the room for anyone who might escalate the situation. The man at the counter hesitated, then finally dropped his gaze. "You don't understand what's at stake," he muttered. But the fire in the waitress's eyes didn't waver. She took a deep breath and revealed the truth that had been hidden all these years, how she had been trapped in a cycle of fear, kept silent by threats and pain until this moment, as her story spilled out. The diner's patrons exchanged looks, their previous hesitation replaced with support. The older man nodded solemnly, and the cook wiped a tear from his eye. The quiet strength of the community was rising around her, just when it seemed the night's darkest chapter had closed. A sharp knock came from the diner's entrance. A local police officer stepped inside, holding up a folder. "We've been investigating this man for years," she said. Eyes on the man at the counter. "He's linked to several cases, and now we have enough to bring him in." The man's face paled, and he made a last, desperate move to leave. But Admiral Harrington was faster, blocking the exit calmly but decisively. "Not tonight," he said. The waitress looked around, relief washing over her face. The town was finally waking up, ready to stand against the shadows. But as the man was led away, Harrington noticed a small folded note slip from his pocket onto the floor. Picking it up, his eyes narrowed. The note was a warning this wasn't over. The real danger was only beginning. Admiral Harrington stood quietly as the man was led away in handcuffs. The weight of the moment settling over the diner like a slow, steady calm after a storm. The waitress, now free from the shadow that had followed her for so long, finally allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Around her, the people who had once been silent witnesses began to speak quietly, offering words of encouragement and support. The town that had seemed trapped in fear was starting to heal, one small step at a time. The older man who had spoken up earlier gave Harrington a nod of thanks. And the cook resumed his work, the atmosphere lighter but still respectful. It was clear that this wasn't just a victory for one woman, it was a moment of change for the whole. Community. Harrington folded the note carefully, his mind racing. The warning inside was a stark reminder that evil doesn't disappear overnight, especially when it's been hidden for so long. But the Admiral was determined. This town, these people, they deserved better. He promised himself he wouldn't let this darkness take hold again as the waitress returned to her work. She no longer moved with hesitation or fear. She carried herself with quiet strength, knowing she was no longer alone. The bruises that had marked her wrist were healing, but more importantly, so was her spirit. The diner's warm lights flickered gently, casting a hopeful glow over the faces of those inside. Admiral Harrington sipped his coffee one last time before standing to leave. Knowing that sometimes true courage was found in the smallest acts, standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced. The town would never forget the night a Navy SEAL Admiral noticed what others didn't, and how his quiet actions helped rewrite the story of a frightened waitress and a community ready to face its shadows. Because sometimes the greatest strength comes from simply choosing to care, and that choice can change everything. If you enjoyed this story and want more intense thrillers and suspenseful ventures, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with friends who love a good mystery. Your support helps me bring you more stories just like this one.